Hey guys, we are ready for our very last packet of new information. Hopefully you've all got your notes. So it's adaptation, speciation, and evolution. And again, I'm kind of counting on the idea that you remember the basics of evolution. Hopefully you watched those two videos I assigned yesterday and you're kind of like, oh yeah, I remember this stuff. This is no big deal. If you are watched those two and you're like, I am still kind of fuzzy on this, please let me know. I'd love to assign you some readings or find some more videos to hopefully clear that stuff up. But we're going in assuming that we kind of have a handle on the basics of how evolution works. So last chapter was all about genes and alleles. And there's a reason this chapter follows that. Or these chapters, I should say. Because the understanding of how DNA and genes and alleles determines traits is really essential to an understanding of how evolution works. Okay, so one thing we haven't really talked about before is this concept of a gene pool. Okay, so this is essentially not looking at any individual crosses like so-and-so mated with so-and-so, this plant crossed with this plant, but rather we're looking at an entire population. Okay, I really like this picture on page 248. Let me just grab it here, where it shows a population of people, and it doesn't show quite the correct blood type alleles, but you see all the different alleles that every person has. Okay, so this would be like for blood type. So this one has an A and an O, this one has two O's. And so if I took all of these alleles that all of these people have, that would constitute the entire gene pool. Okay, so it's the overall, what are the genes in this population? Okay, so again, we're being very much general, not talking about any specific cross. And if you know the gene pool, you can really use that to make some predictions. So we have this concept called the Hardy-Weinberg law. And you're lucky because I don't know anything about Hardy and Weinberg, so I can't ask you to know anything about them. But it states simply that if you have a Mendelian trait, which remember is you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Okay, so this is only talking about Mendelian traits, none of that polygenic stuff or codominance or any of that. Okay, then the following is always true, and I wish I would have centered this or made it bigger somehow. There's your equation. Okay, and you guys have lucked out. We haven't really had to do math in this class, but we're going to do some math here. Okay, so this looks like absolute gibberish. Okay, but let's look down here. So we have the frequency of the dominant allele is P. Frequency of the recessive allele is Q. And I should have put this up above. But when we're talking about the frequency of something, it's just how common it is. And instead of expressing it as a percentage, we're always going to use the decimal form. Okay? So it turns out the square of the frequency of the dominant allele plus 2 times the frequency of the dominant allele times the frequency of the recessive allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele squared always equals 1. Okay, well, this is weird. What is this actually going to tell us? Well, P squared is the frequency of homozygous dominant individuals. Okay, so if I do the math and P squared is 0.25, that would mean 25% of this population is homozygous dominant. Okay, 2PQ is the frequency of heterozygotes. So if I take 2 times P times Q and I get 0.5, that would mean 50% of my population is probably heterozygous. Okay, and so you kind of start to see how this works. And we can use this kind of in two ways. Okay, if we know P and Q, right, we can plug those into our equation and figure out how common each of these different genotypes is probably. So that works. Or if we know the frequency of the homozygous recessive individuals, we can also kind of backwards figure everything else out. So I made an example of each. I have no idea why this is example 3. Let's make it example 1. The next one's 2, so I don't know how that got messed up. But we have example 1. In a certain population, albinism is a recessive Mendelian trait whose allele makes up 1% of the gene pool in a certain population, while normal pigmentation makes up 99% of the gene pool. What percent of the population do you expect to be homozygous normal pigmentation, heterozygous, and have the trait albinism? Okay, so let's see, what are these numbers? Okay, so we said albinism is recessive, so we would say normal pigmentation is dominant. Okay, so let's make, capital N for normal pigmentation, and lowercase n would then be albino. Okay, which isn't actually going to matter. I just wanted to kind of lay it out so it's easy to see which one's dominant and which one's recessive here. Okay, so the allele for albinism is 1%. Okay, so in our equation, recessive is Q. Okay, so Q's frequency is 1% of the gene pool, so as a decimal, we would write it as 0.01. So P is the dominant one. Its frequency is the other 100% of the the rest to get up to 100%. So 1%, so it must be 0.99. Okay, from here it's kind of just plug it into the equation and see what you can do here. Okay, so frequency of homozygous dominant individuals is P squared. So 0.99 squared plus 2 times P, which is the 0.99, times Q is 0.01, plus Q squared, so 0.01 squared. I probably overused parentheses. I don't know why I like them so much. So, rather than actually calculate what this is, we know that it should equal 1. Okay, so it doesn't really matter that we actually figure it out and add them up. We might want to do that to double check that we did it correctly and make sure that they actually add up to 0.01. But whatever this is, tells us what the frequency of individuals are that would be NN. Right, so if their genotype is NN, so we take 0.99 squared, and that is 0.9801. Okay, maybe we'll have write this down here. So 0.9801. So that means NN is 98.01% of the population. Okay, so second bundle here, my 2PQ, I go 2 times 0.99 times 0.01, and I get 0.0198. Remember, this represents heterozygous. So NN, okay, remember we to go from a decimal to a fraction, move the decimal point over 2, so that'd be 1.98% of the population. Okay, and the last 0.01 squared is 0.0001. Remember, that represents the homozygous recessive, so that would be 0.01% of the population. Okay, so to check that we did it right, let's take these frequencies and make sure they add up to 1. Okay, so I have 0.9801 plus 0.0198 plus 0.0001, and I get exactly 1. Okay, so remember, frequencies are the decimals. When we're talking about the percentages, we want to take it times 100. So that means, 1/100th of 1% of the people in this population would have the albinism trait. 99.99% would have normal pigmentation. Remember, because that would be both of these. Let's maybe do that here. Phenotype, right? Normal pigmentation. would be 99.99%. And so this one, phenotype, I might have misspelled that, albinism, 0.01%. Okay, so remember from the last chapter, if you are a dominant allele, you can be homozygous or heterozygous, you're going to have the same trait. All right, so that is example 1. I kind of wish I would have made example 2 because it's the hard one. Okay, so example 2 is deceptively easy. Okay, so in a certain population of peas, 25% of the plants have white flowers. Recall, white flowers are recessive to purple flowers. Just remember our allele for purple would be capital P and white lowercase p. Okay, so you're like, oh man, this is gonna get ugly. And I kind of did this. I wrote out, okay, so I'm like, I know, p squared, I don't know, plus 2p, q would be 0.25, plus 0.25 squared equals 1. And I'm looking and I'm thinking, man, this is going to be some ugly math. But it's not. Okay, so we only have these 2 alleles, right? That's it. Okay, the white is recessive, which means those 25% must be little p. Okay, so I know, okay, that I almost caught myself doing the wrong thing here. Okay, this is unfortunate that our formula has the same letters as our alleles. Okay, so remember in our equation, p squared equals 2pq, not plus q squared equals 1. Okay, q squared is the frequency of the recessive trait showing up. Okay, so q squared equals 0.25. Because white is recessive, 25% have white. So remember, q squared is the proportion that have the recessive trait, and that is 0.25. Okay, so in math, when we have something squared, we don't want to know what q squared is, we want to know what q is. All right, so to get rid of a squared in math, we square root. So q equals the square root of 25, the square root of 0.25, which is 0.5. Okay, so if we only have these 2 alleles, q is half of them, p must also be half of them, because we have to add up to 1, right? So what are the allele frequencies of white and purple alleles? This one is the white allele, and this one is the purple allele. So there you go. There is your answer. You don't actually have to use this equation at all. You just have to use the knowledge that q squared is the frequency of the recessive trait showing up, the homozygous recessive allele carriers. So q squared equals that percentage, but as a decimal. Okay, so the rule, Hardy-Weinberg says that those allele frequencies will stay the same. Okay, if something is in what we call Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so we've used the word equilibrium before. It kind of means a state of balance where maybe you have a little bit of change, but it kind of is in flux and it'll kind of overall stay the same. Okay, so those frequencies will not change if something is in what we call Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, but turns out populations are hardly ever in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so if something's going to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we have all of these conditions. Okay, so we have conditions here. And if they are not met, then we're not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, and those allele frequencies can change. Okay, but if we are in equilibrium, mating is random. Okay, so there's no like some males are more successful than other males. There's no, you know, the pretty peacock gets all the chicks. Nothing like that. Mating is completely random. There are no mutations, right? Because if there's mutations, we might have an introduction of more alleles, and that would clearly cause things to change. Third condition or assumption is there is no migration. Okay, so think about, you know, in my certain population of pea plants, half of my alleles are the white alleles and half are the purple alleles. Well, all of a sudden, I bring in a pack of seeds that I got at the store that are all purple flowering ones. Is that going to change my allele frequencies? Yes. Okay, so I can't have migration in or out. Okay, population is large. Okay, this matters basically in statistics or any kind of probability situation. If your population is small, there's just this random chance factor that if something randomly happens, it'll have a big effect on the outcome. So if your population is large, things are going to work out and you should have that Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And the fifth kind of assumption or rule for something to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that all genes are equally good at making the organism fit. Which, remember, in evolutionary terms, to call something fit means it's able to survive and reproduce. Okay? So let's think about this just a little bit. Okay? So in any population, is the mating usually random? Okay, I hope you know the answer is no. Right? There are some individuals in a population who are more successful at mating than others. Okay, take humans, for example. Like, there's people who live their lives and don't have any kids, and I'm not saying that makes them unsuccessful at life, but it does make them unsuccessful at passing their genes on. Okay, and other people might have 10 kids. You don't know. Okay, and it's not random. Okay, it's not like we're randomly assigned partners. People with the same, you know, ideas and things that they like tend to mate together, and it's the same. Well, it's not the same, but if you think about animals, okay, everything you know about the animal kingdom, you know, think about elk or deer or that kind of organism. Like, one buck is going to mate with lots of females, and there's other bucks that don't get any females. Okay, so it's not random. There are no mutations. Hopefully we had like a whole chapter, that part of a chapter anyway, that talked about mutations. We know mutations happen a little bit all the time. There's going to be migration. There are populations that are small. And this is kind of, to me, maybe the most profound one. Obviously, not all genes are equally good at making the organism fit, right? So some alleles are going to be beneficial, and some alleles are going to be detrimental. And so this one is hardly ever met. So if any of the criteria above are not met, which is basically all the time, the population's allele frequency is changing, and we say that's evolution. Okay, the population is changing. The population set of genes that they have is changing as time goes on. Okay. Oops, excuse me. All right, I just want to do just a tiny, tiny bit on the next page, then we're going to stop. Because I felt like we just kind of went into this. So we are tweaking our definition of evolution because we have more information and we're going more in depth than we did last year. So evolution is any change in allele frequency over time. Okay, so think about this. So early humans all had darker skin. Okay, some people began to live in Europe. Darker skin became more of a negative than a positive because it was stopping people from absorbing enough vitamin D in the colder northern climates of Europe, and so lighter skin became an advantage. Okay, allele frequency changed over time. Lighter skinned alleles became more common because they were beneficial. evolution has changed the human population. Okay? And so, you know, we're not just talking about big time changes. Okay? It's any change in allele frequency over time, and we can talk about a population evolving, and some members of its species somewhere else might not evolve that way. Okay? Okay. There is 2 major steps to evolution. This is one part that I kind of simplified. So, step 1, there is hereditary variation. Okay, so not all members of a population are the same. Step 1. Okay, step 2, alleles that make an organism are, I think I have to say here, more fit, are selected for, aka passed on more often to the next generation. So in essence here, not everybody's the same, and if you're better, you get to have more babies. Okay, and remember, in terms of evolution, more offspring is success. And that's essentially evolution, right? There's variety, and some varieties are more likely to breed. And we will save the rest for another day. I'm going to put an assignment on that hopefully after this you'll have no problem with. All right, bye.